Hi, everyone. Welcome back to CAHS Career Prep, where we talk all about how to get you ready for a career in arts, humanities, and social sciences. I'm Nicole McDavid, and in today's episode, we will be talking all about interviewing. To discuss this topic, we have professional Owen Franklin here with us today. Owen Franklin is the CEO of Blue Summit Supplies. He started their company from scratch and has hired over 60 people since they started 7 years ago. He started out with no hiring process at all, and today they use a pretty strict process, interviewing committee that is paired with outside consultants to help them find the best and great candidate. Hiring is still very hard, and they have a lot of lessons that they have learned that Owen's going to share with us today. Thank you so much for coming, Owen.
Happy to be here. Thank you for taking the time to interview me.
Yeah. So we'll just kind of jump into the interview questions. And these questions that we've created have been put together by our students at UAH. So it really gets to the heart of things that they are wanting to know of, what do you do when you go out to that first interview and make sure that it is success and that you feel success from it, even if you don't get the job, that you feel like it was a successful interview. So with the interview, one of the most common questions, and I think this is so interesting because I actually teach this a little bit in public speaking, but how do you work to appear confident in your verbal delivery of content and maybe avoid filler words like and
Yeah, so I'm smiling because of the road that just some of the interviews that I have done when I was the person being interviewed, and just the anxiety that I've had.
Yeah.
And I didn't do a lot of interviews. I worked in my original career, and stayed at base with the same company. But one of the things that I used to do was, like, today I have it, is water. Like, it's like my safety blanket, let's call it. And so I would bring water, like a glass of bottle of water, to kind of help. And I never really thought a lot about. For me, the anxiety was like getting there. And
Right.
Like, it was just like this, like you're sitting in the lobby waiting for the interviewer, and you're like, let's go. But like,
Right.
my piece of advice would be, don't. And this is coming from someone who's done probably 100 interviews at this point in the last 4 or 5 years. Like, I don't really worry about someone who's nervous. Frankly, if they're nervous, I think especially someone that's young in their career. Like, I expect you to be nervous.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not nervous, then you don't care very much,
Yes.
And so, like, my first piece of advice would be, don't worry about it so much. Just be yourself, And if you say some, like if I'm interviewing, I'm going to smile, and I'm probably going to say, it's okay. This is, I'm no problem. You're nervous. Like, I'm very direct. And so my advice would be, don't worry about it. And when I'm interviewed, I'm nervous. When the people you're competing with, they're nervous. They're all nervous,
Yeah.
And I had a funny story. I was being nervous, looking nervous apparently is not necessarily a bad thing. I should just share a piece of some of my experience. I interviewed for this leadership development program at Lockheed Martin that I really, really wanted to get into. It was really important to me, and it was on a VTC, kind of like this, where I can see the people, but they were in California.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really nervous. Like, I was to the point of I was going to throw up in the bathroom.
Yes.
Yeah. And I did the interview, and I thought the interview went really well, and I didn't get the position. And I was pretty upset about it. Like, to this day, it still makes me mad. And I probably never would have started this company if I'd gotten that, ironically enough. But the interviewee told me I didn't get the job because he felt like I was so nonchalant and calm that it didn't even seem important to me.
Oh.
And I was like, dude, that's what a leader's supposed to do, is be calm under pressure. And he said, no, you didn't even. So, like, maybe being nervous is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
So I think that, I guess, the takeaway there would be, is when I'm interviewing people, I expect you to be nervous. And I've actually been given advice that being super cool is a bad thing. So don't worry about it.
Right. And I think that, to me, that's such an interesting insight. I would love to talk to that interviewer.
Me too.
Because,
Me too.
Right? Because that's actually one of the things that when we talk about anxiety, and I've talked about anxiety in some of my courses and with students, anxiety doesn't always present itself how people expect it to be presented. And so sometimes when people feel anxiety, they actually tend to shut down. And so they will have that kind of more nonchalant, calmer demeanor. It doesn't mean
I
that they
make a
don't
lot of
have.
jokes when I'm nervous.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
my coping mechanism.
Yes. Yeah. Like that's what
Yeah.
everybody has, like a different kind of coping mechanism with it. So I think that's important to kind of go into it feeling like you can be yourself. It's okay if you're nervous because everybody's nervous within
Everybody's
it.
nervous.
Yeah.
And I think it's something
Yeah.
that when you go into your career and you're new, like they expect you to be like, I thought that these like, oh my God, this guy is the manager of mechanical engineering at Boeing. Like he's this incredibly guy and I can't be nervous. Like he's nervous when he interviews too.
Yeah.
He's just a dude,
Right.
just a woman. Like it's no big deal.
Right.
And so I think that like to humanize it a little bit and just remember that we're all imperfect and we all are nervous.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. So when you're going into the interview, I think one of the questions that our students have especially is, how do you know what is appropriate or professional to wear for the interview? How do you kind of
Coming
figure
from
that
the guy
out?
that's wearing a workout shirt in this interview.
It's Friday.
Yeah, and I guess it's our little room. So we have our own culture, which I hear Grace talk
Yeah.
about. So, I will say this: when I go visit customers and I go overseas and visit suppliers, I wear a suit.
Right.
And so, I kind of look at, especially if you're young in your career, I think it's, in my opinion, it is best to err on the side of professionalism.
Right.
Because you can't mess up dressing. Generally speaking, you can't mess up dressing up.
Right.
And I am, if someone came to the office in an interview at our company wearing what I'm wearing, it would feel weird to me.
Yeah.
And so I think generally speaking, I cannot speak at all to women's dress. I can hardly dress myself, but for a man, I think it is very, very important to wear even a tie. I think if you wear a suit and a tie, you now remove that from the conversation.
Yeah.
No one's going to say anything you're not saying, but if you wear like a t-shirt, they're going to comment on it.
Right.
And depending on the company's culture, it may not matter. But like, again, our company's culture is like, I'm literally wearing a workout shirt, right? But if you're interviewing here, to me, it's like the professional thing to do is like, in like, you need to feel the room, and like maybe the second interview you would not wear a tie or something.
Right.
But like, I think that if my piece of advice would be to err on the side of being extra professional, just as a de-risker.
Yeah.
It's one less thing to worry about. Because if a man, and again, I'm talking from you share maybe you can translate the suit and tie version from what a woman would wear. But to me, if you wear a suit and a tie, no one is going to notice, and it will be a non-issue one way or the other.
Yeah.
And so now they're going to focus on what are the other things. Like there's lots of checks that people mentally make, and especially in Huntsville, the culture is, it's a southern. I guess maybe it's always like that, but like it's going to be more formal, and like this is what is expected. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that is a good idea when you're going in for that first interview. And one of the things that we talk about with students a lot is dress your best. And so what your best is, and for that part of the industry, because we have students that go into pretty eclectic range of different industries, but dress your best for it and do your research. I still remember when I was trying to get a summer job, I was in college, and it was at a country club, and my mom had told me about the opening, and so I ran by to give them my resume, and I was in like shorts and a t-shirt, and I went in and they were like, oh, well, okay. And I was applying for a job as a hostess,
noticed.
and they noticed, and I said immediately, which was probably at that point wisdom beyond my 21 years, I was like, let me come back and interview in a little bit. Do you have a time that I can come back and interview? And they said, oh yes. And they set up, an interview for later on. And I went home and I changed into just and that's one of the things, like, it doesn't have to be, sometimes we think when we're dressing up that it has to be really expensive or something like that. I think I changed into like a very simple, like shift dress, knee length, basic, but looked more professional, put on some flats, not my flip-flops that I was wearing before, and went back in and interviewed and did get the job for the position, because it was for a country club and I was going to be working as a hostess there. And so they were looking to see that, I think in part, that I was going to be able to dress up for that particular role. And so that fit with that particular culture. And so knowing and understanding the culture, and that's one of the things that goes back to what Grace and I talked about, I think is really important.
That's a good point. I think I'm answering that question from the lens of what, like, where I interviewed before, which are like, big engineering, massive engineering companies, or even our company's a little bitty company. And that would be the advice I give. I think the nice thing is it just, if you wear the professional, what you said or what I said, you just remove it from the conversation. And
right.
No one, again, they don't notice one way or the other, and then you move on to what actually matters. And
right.
Another example would be, I remember one of the law firms I work with, and these business lawyers are, very highly, $500, $600, $700 an hour attorneys, and we're talking about pretty serious things. And he came into the meeting and he was wearing duck boots, a golf shirt, and jeans. And I noticed.
Yeah.
I didn't really care, but like it stuck out as odd to me. And so now I'm thinking, well, is this guy not professional? And then he immediately commented, "Hey, I was with my children, blah blah blah. I had to run into the office. Excuse what I'm wearing."
Yeah.
And so because again, it's just kind of like if you the norm in Huntsville, in my opinion, is a suit. So if you wear it, no one notices, and then
right.
you move on to what matters.
Right. Yeah. I think that's great advice. So, what are some of the most important questions that someone can ask when they're in the interview process?
I think I think I'm going to answer that question from two different jobs. I think since our audience is generally less, we're not talking about someone interviewing for a CFO job.
Right.
I think if you were brand new and you're straight out of school and this is your first professional job, and I'm going to define professional as an example, we'll say an accountant, a lawyer, marketing, engineer, somewhere where you got a college degree and you're going, that's where I'm used to interviewing people in that realm, let's say. So I don't really expect you to be like super knowledgeable on the job. Like you just got out of college. Like you don't know, like my engineering manager, who was my manager's boss, he looked at me and says, "Yeah, you don't even know anything yet, so we got to teach you that."
Yeah.
The fact is you don't. Like you're in college and you've learned a lot, but like you don't know, you haven't been in industry yet. And I've been trying to run a company for 7 years, and I would say I know very little. And I think that the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And so I don't expect someone straight out of school to know everything. And so really I expect less questions about the job specifics and more questions about the company, where the company is going, and what this job is. And I don't expect like detailed questions.
Right.
I expect more like, hey, what am I going to do in this job?
Yeah.
What does success look like to you in my role that you're hiring for? What are you looking for? What are you excited about in this job? But I think the biggest thing to me is energy, curiosity, and like generally caring.
Yeah.
Like, do you actually want to learn about the company and the job you're hiring for or not? Right. Because if you're, and like, I think that maybe, I don't know if we'll get to this, but I'll just say it, like, you need to have questions.
Yes.
Like if I get to every interview I ever do is I begin with, I'm going to ask you about you because I care about you, and I'm going to ask you about your job experience, and then I'm going to give you a lot of time to ask questions at the end, and I'm going to make sure we do that. And I finish an interview and say, okay, that's all the questions I have. What questions do you have for me? And if you have no questions, it's done.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in hiring you. And maybe it's because maybe I'm interviewing at a little bit higher level, but like you need to have, like if you're about to take a job, like you should have questions about that, because in theory you could spend years or decades there. Like you should have questions about the company. But again, I think takeaways there, again, I kind of ramble. So genuine curiosity about the company, at least the company, and then at the job. But again, if you're new, like you haven't been in this, let's say you're interviewing for a marketing associate role. I think if you ask like, hey, what is your click-through rate on a Facebook ad typically?
Yeah.
Like, I don't expect you to ask that question. Now, if you're interviewing for a director of marketing job, so now let's step up. Let's say you have 5 years experience, you've gone back and gotten an MBA, and you're interviewing for a director of marketing role.
Yeah.
That role, if I'm interviewing that role, this is going to be someone that's going to be on my leadership team. This is someone who, I kind of thinking about the person who is here as our director of marketing, kind of what I think she would ask. I would expect her to ask questions about the job. And I don't mean like high level, hey, what do you want from the job? I mean like, hey, what is the director of marketing's key objectives for the next year?
Yeah.
And then I would answer, let's say I need them to build out a Facebook architecture,
Yeah.
Facebook ad architecture. And then I would either expect them to say, I don't know a lot about that. Don't be afraid to say you don't know something. Frankly, if someone tells me they don't know something, I respect them for that, because I do not expect you to know everything. If you think you know everything, I don't want you to work here, because no one knows everything. I don't care who you are.
Yeah.
And so then, but let's say she has Facebook. I see that she's got Facebook ad experience on her resume because she put it on there. I expect her to ask, or him to ask details. Hey, what is your strategy on Facebook ads right now? What is your budget?
Yeah.
Who can I hire?
Yeah.
Do I have a hiring budget? How much do I hire? Because one of the interviewees that I had for interviewing as a CTO, I remember him saying, I need to be able to do this job well, and I need to be able to hire 3 people to do this job well based on the requirements. So you see that candidate is now building a plan already before he's even started. And so then I can take that and I walk my way down. Okay, what kind of candidates would you hire? And he'd say, well, I want a front-end developer for this and a back-end developer for this, and I think I need this, but I need more information about your plans here.
Yeah.
And so we've taken this higher level, like inexperienced person who's just going to ask higher level things, and now we're starting to walk down into detail. And I want to have conversations at a detailed level with this individual if they're going to be in a little bit higher position.
Yeah.
Again, back to the marketing example. What is your, hey, I've spent, 100 grand on Facebook ads in the last 6 months, and I expect her or him to say, well, what was your ROAS on that? What was your click-through rate? And then if they have experience, I'll say, oh, really? Yeah, we spent $7 million and we got this. This was a challenge I had. And I'd ask, well, tell me about that challenge. How did you handle that?
Yeah.
But you need to be able to talk technical if you're interviewing something a little higher level.
Right.
If you're new, I don't expect that.
Right.
And if you have it and you're new, then I'm going to be blown away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's important to understand where you're at the particular levels of, the career path that you're on in the interview part of it. And so the questions that you ask when you're going into a position for the first time are going to be different than the questions that you ask when you're going into a position and you have 10, 15, plus years experience. Those questions are going to change. And I think the main thing is to have questions.
And be curious.
You need to have questions. You need to show that you have done some research on the company. And if you're going in, to jump off of what you were talking about, if you're going in for a position as a social media manager, you need to know what social media the company actually has. You need to know what they've been doing on social media.
I love your post on X.
Yes.
Tell me about how you created that creative. Did you split test it?
Exactly.
Why did you choose this color instead of this color? I think this color would have been good.
Yeah. You need to have details. Yeah, definitely. So,
do you care or not?
Right. Yeah.
Do you want this job? Why am I going to hire you?
Yeah.
I think that's so and again, I get a lot on energy is important to me. Passion is important to me. And just simply caring.
Yeah.
But that's really, and honestly, I've made a lot of great hires.
Yeah.
And the best hires I have are the ones that show passion and interest, and they have this interest in something related to the job.
Right.
And those people have excelled, and Grace, and I don't know if you've interviewed Shannon, but they are good examples of that.
Yeah, that's great. So when you're in that interview and you're being asked, different questions, I always think of where do you see yourself in 10 years, or tell us about yourself, all of those great big open-ended questions that sometimes happen. What are some ways that students can think about how to best showcase their abilities to, present, where you're not just even what I think about is how do they not just regurgitate their resume? How do they take it further in showing those abilities?
Well, I think let's just build on what we just talked about.
Yeah.
I think that again is preparation for interviews. If you're spending 15 minutes to prepare for an interview, you're not prepared.
Yeah.
Maybe 3 hours, maybe 2 hours, but look at the job description. And sometimes these big companies, and really, I think sometimes most companies, the job descriptions kind of suck. They kind of suck. And then sometimes you get and I think that it just depends on the culture of the company, but I know a lot of times they're just copied and pasted from other ones.
Yes.
So especially in a second interview, maybe you could ask some questions and come back and be prepared. But let's say the job description there's some detail there, but let's say that you're interviewing for a social media job.
Yeah.
And Actually, let's use this. This is for the College of Arts. So there's something in that arts in that department.
Like graphic design.
Yeah. So let's use graphic designers
Yeah,
as an
graphic
example.
design.
Because I can actually somewhat talk about that. Was we have two great designers here.
Yeah.
So let's say I expect you in the job description, and we're pretty new at this, and like we said in the beginning, we begin a process over time that sucked or doesn't exist at first, and it's getting better. But like we in our job creative graphic design position, we had builds, product, packaging. And so, what a good way to do it's how I would do this. My piece of advice would be for that designer is I would read the job description and see that's there. There's a technical specific thing that I can talk about.
Yeah.
In the context of this company, and they say they need help with that, and I would go to my website. I would go to that company's website, and I go find a packaging example.
Yeah.
And then, in the creative sense, I would probably try to bring like a portfolio or maybe spend an hour and design a graphic of how I got inspiration from this and here's what I did.
Yeah.
Go spend 30 minutes. Actually, I say that and I don't know how long Shannon and Jess remind me how long it takes to do this stuff. Okay, maybe that's too far, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But like, again, you've taken a specific thing in the job description, you've gone and gotten like actual real world information about the company and said, hey, I like the packaging design you did here. And then talk about it. Oh, in my class, I did this design and I used this color. Or in my internship, they ran this Facebook ad and we split tested it with a red and an orange, and the orange really popped, and we got a higher click-through rate. Or, I love the design you did on this product, on this, like talk specifics about relevant things that you've researched that you can type, even if the depth is little.
Yeah.
It's showing you cared enough to read the job description, you cared enough to research it, and then you're relating your experience. And if you're new out of college and you don't have real experience and you're able to do that level, which to me is not a lot of work, like maybe that's an hour of work.
Right.
To me, like if I was interviewing a graphic designer now, I would be visibly impressed to the point that I would say it to them and I would tell the hiring manager that was impressive.
Yeah. And I think that's great to have that way to actually show different things that you're talking about and bring in those materials. So like if I know for our students who are in graphic design or other areas of art design, we have many, they're going to bring in a portfolio to every interview they do. For our other students, when they're coming into an interview, is there something that they need to bring with them besides their resume? Do they even need to bring their resume now?
I think bringing a resume is like a cool, like again, is kind of one of those things that like it's this kind of societal norm that's common, and so just do it just to have it. The interview, like if you gave me your resume, I'm gonna have it already, and I'm gonna take notes. I already had notes. I prepare for the interview, but to me, it just shows like a little bit of preparedness,
Okay.
So I would recommend bringing it. But I mean, let's say you're interviewing. Give me an example of someone that's a major in this college that is not gonna. Doesn't make sense to bring physical assets.
So I'm thinking like if we have our students who would be in writing, they may bring a portfolio of their writing for our proposal writers and technical writers. I would say like maybe like our students who are in psychology, organizational psychology, we have master's and PhD program in that. So students who are planning to go into either with the undergraduate and field of counseling or in the graduate programs going into industry and working in organizational psychology.
So that's something that I have a little bit of experience with, and so I can somewhat talk. So I have an executive coach he has a PhD in organizational psychology, and who is a professor at DePaul in organizational psychology. And then, of course, the Grace, who you met previously, is getting a degree to kind of do some similar work inside our company. And so if I was interviewing an organizational psychologist, let's say I was interviewing someone to become an executive coach inside my company.
Right.
Or I was interviewing a consultant like we do, like we're adding someone to our company now from that company and we're interviewing them. So, and let's say they have no experience. Let's say they're getting their PhD or their master's degree and they're going to go in the industry and they don't have experience. I think if I was them and I was interviewing them, what I would love to see is for them to talk to me about some reading or articles or books that somewhat related to the job description, that they say, hey, for example, one of my favorites that we use a lot that I'm quite miserable at and trying to work on very hard is to be much more humble in how I inquire about questions.
Yeah.
And so there's this book called Humble Inquiry that is actually, I think, a textbook. It's Paul. And so I would say at the end of the when the interviewer says, "Hey, what questions do you have?" You could say, I read this book, Humble Inquiry, and I have seen when I am on my internship or when we in class or on the book, this problem seems like a problem that's common. Do you see that problem often in your company, and how do you handle that problem? You can say, do you find that your leaders tend to close down when someone tells, hey, you need to do this. When a peer tells some other peer to do this, is it common for you to see the other person to shut off and not listen? Is that common for you? And it's a very specific thing to the book that if someone read it would understand. The leader would understand what that is. And so now we're talking like a very technical thing with some reference that's not like, I read this book or I did this thing. So now we're having a conversation that shows that they're curious, they're interested, they're asking a good question, and that they care enough to ask the question. So again, I think kind of going back to the original things, it's like somehow relating the job description to your experience and so you did research and you actually know something about the topic and you want to talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that, so for a lot of our students, the research that they do, the projects that they do throughout their college career, many of those can be connected in, and we don't always think about them. And so I think one of the things that we've talked a lot with students about is like keeping like a running list of the things that you've done. And because those are times that you can connect in, you can be like, I learned this in this class. This is a really interesting way of, segmenting it in and bringing in that extra kind of information. The question about what are your weaknesses? How do you answer it? So I say, tell us about your weaknesses.
So
how do you make it not sound fake and be like, I'm just too good at everything? It's so difficult.
So I'll answer that question from my experience. I don't actually ask that question. Probably should, actually. I don't think I'm a tough enough
Oh, no,
interviewer.
I've given you a question.
But, when I prepped for interviews, especially that interview that I didn't get, the leadership development, it was very like leadership oriented. So it was a very behavioral focus. It was a very behavioral focused interview. So talking about your weakness is a behavioral question, right? It's not a, hey, what was your ROI on this ad campaign? It's much more behavioral.
Yeah.
And so I remember preparing for that. I don't think I had very good answers when and again, it's right out of school. And so I felt like if someone directly out of school had a good answer to that, I'd be pretty impressed. Like if they gave me just kind of an answer, like it would be like, not in favor, not good, not bad. I would move on, and that would be not a sticking point in the interview. I wouldn't bring that up, but it wouldn't hurt them or help them. But now, if I spent, 7 years trying to run a company, I could talk for the next 5 hours about all of my weaknesses and how terrible they are and all the stupid things I've done. And so I think as you get, the more experienced you get, you better start learning where you're weak. And if you're not learning. But if you're brand new, I think that frankly, every single person in this room and in this world has a ton of weaknesses.
Sure.
And so I think that as long as the person if the person is brand new and coming out of school, if the person doesn't, as long as they don't say, I don't have any weaknesses, I think it's whatever they say is probably okay.
Yeah.
And because, someone saying that I don't make a lot of mistakes and I'm a perfectionist is not a very good thing to say.
Right.
And but even if they could just share a mistake they made and saying something I've worked on, I learned this. Just pick out one mistake, saying, sometimes I lose attention to detail because I get excited, or sometimes I'm so detail oriented it kind of slows me down, and I wish sometimes I could step up a level and do that and not obsess over the detail so I can move forward. Or sometimes when I get really nervous, I shut down. I don't ask enough questions, and I wish that I did that. Something just a simple thing. Now, if you're more if I was interviewing a CTO, like we talk about like my hiring process and having consultants. Like I actually have the organization that we have, the executive coach who's an organizational psychology organization. I have them interview them just for behavioral questions.
Yeah.
It's a 2-hour interview just for behavior.
Wow.
After they've taken a massive test.
Yeah.
And so that they're going to talk a lot about their weaknesses, and I expect them to have some pretty good answers.
Right.
But yet again, straight out of school, you haven't lived life enough in the professional world to make mistakes. You haven't even had a professional job.
Right.
So it's hard to but maybe you could share, some mistakes you made on tests.
Yeah.
Go find a mistake and just talk about the mistake.
Yeah.
Show that you're humble enough to admit that you're not perfect, because no one is. And the more I learn about business and professionals, the more I realize that these people who I used to think they were just like these icons of business or these wonderful leaders, they actually are not that good at it. They're just trying.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's great insight, because everybody's going to have different weaknesses. And I think it's important to think about, and one of the things that you talked about really well is the idea of pairing it. So you have, this weakness, but you pair it with what you are working on. So one of mine is that I will always tend to go down rabbit holes. And so I get really excited about stuff and I'll start researching. And then all of a sudden I've, ordered 5 books and I'm like knee deep, like reading these books, and I'm going to find everything out about it. And then my husband would be like, "Are you going to get a degree in this?" And I'm like, "No, I just need it for one lesson." He's like, "It might be too much." And so I've learned to kind of scale back. To think about, okay, this is the amount that I need to know. This is the amount that I need to teach it well. This is the knowledge that I already have coming into it. So really just thinking about how do you pair that, because we all are going to have different things. And I think it goes back to what we talked about before, that you're going to have different things at different stages of your career. What you start out with as a weakness and how that kind of moves forward is going to change.
One of my favorite entrepreneurs is Ray Dalio, and he says it's not a weakness if you find a solution.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of, I have one big strength where I'm very, very intense and I like to go very, very fast. And I do a lot of really bad negative things because of that. And all of those things come up. And so what I do is I keep like lists, and I just put things in place to prevent me from doing that.
Yeah.
And just sharing one of those things, just because, again, you don't want to do like what I'm doing right now and just ramble on and on. But I think that just sharing something is and just showing some humility, I think, is very important, especially early in your career.
Yeah.
And laugh about it. Everybody's an idiot a lot.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think that's the thing that we get.
That's how it goes.
Yes. And I think it becomes, I think for many students, when they get to that point where they're interviewing for that job out of college, it becomes very all-consuming, very intense. Just from the conversations I've had with students, you get to this point where definitely like they're putting out a lot of resumes. It feels like you're sending them into a void. You finally get an interview and you feel like all of this pressure to make it the most perfect interview ever. And I think that really can be stifling, because it's true. Like, everybody's human, everybody's going to mess up. And so having that idea in mind as you go into it.
I mean, even saying like, one of my biggest weaknesses, I get really nervous, and I'm really nervous right now. And I was stumbling earlier. Like, people, and I think the biggest thing is like the person you're interviewing, I don't care if they're the CEO of Amazon, they're not perfect. And they have made and if the more sense of all, the more big mistakes they've made. And they understand that. And if they don't understand that, you don't want to work for them.
Yeah.
And so just relax a little bit.
Yeah.
I just remember myself, and I was so nervous. And I don't think it was necessary.
Yeah. And I think that it's definitely something that comes with time and age. But it is something that the more that you can kind of focus on that, you can get it earlier. Are there any questions that are like typical of interviews that you can think of, like the most common questions?
I mean, tell me about your company. My background, how I got to this role, for me has been rather unorthodox. A lot of them will laugh and say, how did you get to this job? Or, what is a typical day like? What is, what is the office culture like?
Yeah.
What is the dress code?
Yeah.
Those are like softballs. I mean, let's list some so you just have a list. Here, just take our list. What is your favorite thing to do at work? I like it when people ask me, what do you like to do for fun, Owen?
Yeah.
What is what are you most, what is the thing that you're most proud of at the company?
Yeah.
What are you most worried about for the future? Do you think your company is stable? Where do you see your company going in 5 years? What do you want to do in 5 years? What do you want this role to be in 5 years?
Yeah.
I mean, just start firing them off.
That's
Honestly, to
great.
me, the
Yeah.
more questions you have is directly proportional to how well I think the interview went.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And I think questions to avoid. I don't know this. I'm going to add a piece of this.
Yeah, go.
In the first interview, do not talk about money and do not talk about benefits.
Yeah.
Do not do it. And again, maybe I'm unique, but I don't think I am. At least the culture we're building is not okay. And this is, again, is what's been interesting about our company is we started from nothing and I didn't expect it to be a company, and now we have a company. And some of the early leaders all said the same things to me, independently of me saying this is now our rules. Like the hiring process we built was kind of organically built from me doing hiring, and then Matt doing hiring, then Shannon doing hiring, then Grace doing hiring. We all kind of came together eventually, like, hey, we probably should like collaborate on how we're doing this and like build a process. And one of the biggest things is don't ask about money on the first interview.
Yeah.
You're going to be able to get that information. Be focused on what is the job, because again, is it like everybody's going to be paid for the job? That's the law,
right?
And a lot of times in big companies that stuff is published. You can go to Glassdoor and look,
right?
But like, be interested about the job and the position and the things we talked about. You're going to be able to have those conversations.
Right.
Don't derail yourself in the first interview. And the first question you ask is, how much money is it paying? And as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to hire you.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's wrong and I'm stupid for doing that, but that's our rule, and I would be very surprised if a lot of leaders disagree with me.
I mean, I think that's really great advice, because it is something that when you're discussing things like money and benefits, that's something that you want to be discussing and negotiating when you've gotten an offer. That's the point that then you have those conversations, because you want to get to that point and you don't want to have a barrier to getting to that particular point. And I think sure.
And you talk about things are common. I see this a lot, and I frankly respect it. Is sometimes in the first interviews, I'll make an answer to my point. Is let's say we had a 10-minute conversation with questions, and they asked a bunch of good questions, and I ask you any more questions, and you can tell they want to talk about it. They're reluctant to talk about it, and they think it's probably, well, actually, what is the benefits like here? Yeah. Like, it's kind of at the end where and it's very common. I would say in a lot of interviews when they ask, I can tell they're reluctant to ask. You can see it on their face, their body language.
Right.
And then you have a little bit of a discussion there.
Yeah.
And I think that's okay, but you do not want to lead with it. And if you only ask one or two questions and then that one's still, but I would just avoid it in the first interview. I think in the second interview, if you have one, it's okay.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's starting to be a more serious, and again, I think the Dynetics, which I'm sure a lot of people know here now, it was bought by Lidos or however you say it. I remember one of the interviewers said, we want this to be as much of an interviewing us as vice versa. So what you're going to be paid on the benefits, those are important things, especially if you're more experienced or maybe if you're coming out of college and you have a family, the job has got to be economically viable.
Right.
But just don't start with that.
Right.
Is my piece of advice.
Yeah, I think that's great. Do you have any other advice you'd want to share with students?
I think what I said, just don't. In hindsight, it's not as big of a deal as you think it is. And I would say just relax and have fun with it, because you're coming out of college, and remember the guy or gal across from you did this and they didn't do a very good job either. And they could tell you interview stories of all the stupid things they've done. I can tell you mine, and just smile and have fun with it. You're brand new and your job is to learn. Go learn something.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Owen, for being here today to talk about interviewing. We would like to thank our sponsor, Blue Summit Supplies, for the wonderful facility that we are in and the resources to make this recording possible. A special thank you to our assistant media writer and researcher, Macy Morgan, video producer and editor, Jesse Hendricks, and producer, Grace Jutel. I'm your host, Nicole McDavid, and we'll see you next time for more CAHS Career Prep.